So Nimco, I just want to welcome you to the Legatum Institute and thank you so much for taking the time this morning to come and celebrate International Women's Day with us. And we wanted to talk with you. You are the co-founder and director of Daughters of Eve, which is an organisation that is focused on ending FGM. And we just wanted to talk with you because we think that that started with a very personal journey for you, didn't it? And can you just unpack how you came to be running this amazing organisation?
Yeah, it was a very personal issue, and FGM is still quite personal to me in the sense that I am one of the 200 million women globally that are living with the consequences of being subjected to this horrific form of gender-based violence. So for me, as a 7-year-old that was living in the UK, we went back to Africa on holiday to Somaliland, and I ended up being in the middle of a civil war there. And then on the way back, I think it was just a way of my mother and my grandmother. And for me, I've just done a lot of unpacking in the last 10 years since being at the front line of this conversation. It was a way of for them just to, I think that was what it was to be a woman was. It was just like a symbolic time. And my mother had very little control about the act of FGM, but she had a lot more control about the way that I was educated and really raised as a woman
That's interesting, isn't it? That she had more control on how you were educated.
Yeah. And I do think that everything changes. So my grandmother was illiterate, had an early forced marriage and had FGM. My mother was able to be literate, had an arranged marriage, which technically she didn't have a choice over. So people would call it arranged, but I think it was just within the context of choice, there was very few of that. And then, but she had FGM, and for me, I was only cut, and there was nothing else that had happened to me. And I think each and every one of our generations within those 3 women pushed forward to the point where my niece, who's now 8 years old, is free from all 3 forms of specific violence that my grandmother underwent as a child. And I think I took that for granted because the act of FGM happened and I was just so confused. I was just thinking, I was asking my mother, how could you do this to me? So I was very angry for a long time in the way that I dealt with the issue of FGM on a personal level and also in a political level, was that it was a sense of urgency and not necessarily a sense of making the fundamental case for a more progressive and better world. And I think that changed with me when I really realized that for me that the apology that I was expecting from my mother was one that I should give. And I had more power over the realities of FGM than my mother did at 25 years older than I am. So it's been a very personal thing, and the starting of Daughters of Eve wasn't necessarily for me to think that we would be at the place that we were today, but was to start the conversation to change the narrative of us saying we need to end FGM, not eradicate it. And I was really bothered by the word eradication as though it was a virus, as though it's something that was like, you caught, as opposed to an organised crime.
It was something that was done to you, an act of will.
And with something which you can end, and which a lot of people had a choice, not my mother maybe directly 100% the choice, but there was a lot of people who had a choice to do something out of that. I don't have any choice whether I catch the flu in a season where the flu is going around, and we can vaccinate ourselves against it. So honestly, the real reason we started Daughters of Eve was for me just to stop that niggling thing when people say eradicate FGM, as though it's a waterborne virus.
And you also talk about breaking the cycle, and that if you can break the cycle of FGM, it's deeply connected with breaking the cycle of poverty as well.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that for me?
So the global average age of FGM is 5, and if you are subjecting girls to 5, then you're basically introducing them into a life of poverty, because where girls are cut, they're not also educated, so you change the value of those girls in that community. In order not to educate girls, it's not a sign of poverty, it's a choice you make. So if you don't have any money, then you don't educate anyone. If you have a choice and you choose to educate the boys, it's because you value them more than the girls. And if you cut those girls, then the value automatically goes down. So if you end FGM and invest in girls in terms of education, really understand them as real agents of change and active citizens, then you are more likely to exit poverty and really have a prosperous country. And that's what the West has done in the last 100 years, is that it's actually got more gender piety in where both girls and boys are educated, and girls and boys have more access to healthcare. So there's no gender-specific things in terms of whether I can register with a GP or not. In Africa, where places FGM is common, if whoever's ill, so if the boy is ill, then he'll probably more likely get access to a hospital because he's seen as the breadwinner and the earner. So if 50% of your population is not working, is not healthy, then poverty is it's going to be a reality.
And there's a substantial body of evidence that women are often these perpetrators behind this FGM crime as well. And how do we as women, I know you've spoken about entrepreneurship amongst women, how do we as women seek to change this?
I think it's a real conversation in the sense that we might sometimes be the ones that are carrying the blade, but we're not really doing it with our own authority. Yeah. It's the social construction of the role that women have. And like I said, within my own family, I remember never really engaging with a cutter, who these women that carry out FGM, because of the fact that I hadn't seen one since the one that cut me and really traumatized me. And every time we did a work in the developing countries, I was very adamant not to see one. And then on that trip that I went with Raggy Omar and the Gates Foundation, Raggy had gone to meet a cutter, and he came back and he said, oh, she says she does it because she's poor. And I said, but there's a lot of poor people that don't do evil things, and poverty is a contributing factor to it, but it's not the only reason. And I said, the reality is that she's unable to deal with her own trauma. So I went and met this woman, and I said to her, I said, so she says, and then she repeated this very well rehearsed narrative of, I do it because I'm poor. If you give me a new livelihood, then I would do that. And I got that to a certain extent, but then I also wanted her to understand the personal connection she had to this. And I said, did you cut your daughter? And she said, yes. And then she also volunteered that she'd also cut her grandchild as well. And I said, did anybody pay you for those? And she said, no. I said, well, then ultimately poverty and you not having money is not the only contributor to why you're cutting.
And you deal with kind of conversations on these sorts of issues all day long, and yet you've remained extraordinarily optimistic. And listening to you speak this morning about your passion to see this ended within a generation, where does that optimism come from?
I have no idea, but I think it's basically having a traumatic life experience very young, not just the FGM, but ultimately living in living in the West and then living in Africa where the war had broken out, and seeing turmoil had kind of thought I used to have a weird saying that you can only die once, so you might as well make a mark now. And it was that reality of fearing death as a 5-year-old when we were in the middle of a war, and fearing death as an 11-year-old when FGM almost killed me for the second time. So I see myself as that I'm here for a reason. So I just constantly have to say the really outside the box things where we have to be hopeful that we can end FGM, we can actually have a prosperous African continent which could hopefully fulfill in contributing to the world differently. But I think I'm also immensely privileged. I think there's a lot of things that people don't understand about the African diaspora. I might have lost a lot of my actual wealth and the status that I had through civil war, but I didn't lose the aspiration that my parents had for me.
Nimco Ali, we love your courage, we love your determination to end FGM, and we're delighted that we've been able to host you here this morning at the Legatum Institute celebrating International Women's Day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.